Greetings, this is Greg. This is an Alfa Romeo 159 Alfetta from 1951. It's one of the first Formula One cars, and along with its very similar predecessor, the 158, was absolutely dominant in racing. The 159 featured a 1.5-liter straight 8-cylinder engine with a maximum of 450 horsepower. That amount of power was made possible by the engine's dual-stage supercharging system. Dual-stage supercharging is the use of one supercharger blowing into another. In other words, it's supercharging the engine supercharger. This technology really came into its own during the Second World War. Grumman's F4F Wildcat and F6F Hellcat fighters used dual stages. So did the Corsair. North Americans' Merlin-powered P-51s used dual stages, as did Germany's TA-152. To be specific, all of these examples use dual stages of mechanically driven superchargers. It's also possible to dual stage with an exhaust-driven turbocharger, but that's really another topic and one for another time. In this video, in regards to dual staging, I'm talking about mechanically driven systems. After the early 1950s, dual-stage superchargers largely fell out of use and were forgotten. Obviously not totally forgotten, or I wouldn't be able to make this video. But you can go to 1,000 car shows and never see a car with dual-stage superchargers. Even at air shows, the only airplanes you're likely to see with dual staging are from the World War II era. In this video, I want to focus on the Alfa Romeo 159 Alfetta's use of dual stages, as it's the best example to use for demonstrative purposes, and it's also a very interesting car with a colorful racing history. Be aware that Alfa Romeo made another car called the Alfetta, and yet a different car called the 159. We are talking about the Formula One 159 Alfetta race car, not a road-going sedan. There are relatively few pictures of these cars, and this will be a long video, so please forgive me for the frequent use of the same picture. The 159 runs a 1479cc straight 8 engine with 425 horsepower in race form. In 1951, that was a crazy amount of power for a sub-1500cc car. Keep in mind, they did this without turbocharging, without intercooling, and without modern engine management systems. It doesn't have airflow sensors, NOx sensors, or any of these aids that we take for granted today. To get that much power from such a small engine, and to do it reliably enough to dominate Grand Prix racing, which it did, the car features a lot of unusual for today technology. The key piece of technology I want to discuss was the supercharging system. It used two Roots superchargers, one blowing into another. Why use a Roots supercharger? The Roots type is not known for its efficiency, and there were certainly more efficient types available. More than that, why use two of them with one blowing into another? It would be a lot easier to use a single larger Roots supercharger with displacement equal to that of the two smaller ones. So why all this complexity? If you have any doubts that this worked, I have to put that to bed right now. The 159's predecessor, the 158, is mostly the same car, a little less boost, a little less power, along with some other changes, different rear suspension. In the 1950 Formula One season, it took first place in 11 races out of 11 entries. For the 1951 season, they ran the 159 and took power up to 425 horsepower via its dual-stage supercharger arrangement. It was actually rated at 450 horsepower, but that was at 10,500 RPM. In racing, they ran with a lower 9,300 RPM redline, holding it back to 425. The 159 took first place in 4 out of 7 races entered and was on the podium in the other 3. The only reason it didn't win every race outright was due to the car's poor fuel economy. It was the fastest thing on the track, but had to stop more often for fuel, and on certain courses, fuel consumption was its Achilles heel. In 1951, Juan Manuel Fangio took the Formula One Drivers' Championship in the 159 Alfetta, and the previous year, Farina took the championship in the very similar and also dual-stage supercharged 158 Alfetta. I think that establishes the fact that the supercharging arrangement worked and that the car was fast. So why a Roots-type supercharger? I guess I'll start with that. Today there are 3 types of mechanically driven superchargers commonly in use: the Roots type, Leuchtturm types, which are often called screw types, and centrifugals. At one time, vane-type superchargers were somewhat common. Volkswagen used them, and axial flow types like this Latham supercharger existed as well. Remember this Latham type for later in the video. Of course, today exhaust-driven turbochargers are common as well. Technically, these are exhaust-driven superchargers, but today when people say supercharger, they usually mean something mechanically driven. Every type of supercharging device has its pros and cons. In 1951, turbochargers existed. In fact, tens of thousands of turbocharged airplanes had been built in the 40s during the Second World War, and those turbos were pretty good, at least in terms of adiabatic efficiency. Not terribly far behind modern turbochargers. However, they were large and bulky. In the Alfetta, packaging a turbocharging system with all the associated plumbing without making the car bigger would have been a problem. Today it would be relatively easy, but it wasn't in 1950. The screw-type supercharger was functionally non-existent in 1950. It was invented on paper in the late 1800s, but the first ones were not built until the early 1950s, and none were commercially available until the late 1950s at best. Today they are common and work well. I have one on my 1985 Alfa Romeo Spider, and it's great. The centrifugal supercharger was at this point by far the most common type of supercharger, and it's very efficient, more so than the root supercharger, especially at that time. The centrifugal was the supercharger design of choice on nearly every combat airplane flown by every nation involved in World War II, and with good reason. It was also the choice for race cars in the United States running on high-speed tracks like the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. Again, there was a reason for that. The centrifugal is easy to package, and it will give more power than the root supercharger. Of course, there has to be a downside, or we would all be using centrifugals, and that would be that. The downside of the centrifugal is in its boost curve. It's only really dominant over the roots type in the upper 20% of the engine's RPM range. That's fine for a World War II fighter plane, which only runs at one specific RPM when at full throttle, due to the nature of its constant speed propeller. In old-time race cars, centrifugals were great if racing on a high-speed oval where the engine stays near peak power RPM much of the time. In the modern world, these can work really well on a street car or all sorts of racetracks if you have a 10-speed automatic transmission that keeps RPM very high anytime you're at full throttle. Where centrifugals are not so great is in an application where you need the engine to pull hard at low and mid-range RPM. For example, when accelerating out of low-speed corners with a 4-speed manual gearbox. In that respect, the root supercharger is superior to the centrifugal, and that's exactly the reason that during the 1920s and 30s, nearly every high-end supercharged European car ran a Roots-type supercharger. In Europe, the race courses simply favored engines with power throughout the RPM range. Over in the United States, where the Indianapolis Speedway represented the pinnacle of motor racing, U.S. manufacturers like Duesenberg and Cord favored the centrifugal. The 159 Alfetta was intended as a Grand Prix or Formula One car, thus it needed a lot of power throughout the RPM range. Hence, a root supercharger was the only real option available at the time. That should explain why they used a Roots blower, but why two of them? That's a more interesting question, and the answer requires some historical and technical knowledge to understand. Roots is capitalized. That's because it's the name of the inventors, two brothers, Francis and Philander Roots. They were not trying to create a supercharger. This was just after the U.S. Civil War, so it's unlikely either of them had ever seen a gasoline piston engine. The Roots brothers were millers. Back in those days, the mill was where you went to get machining type work done, and those mills were often powered by water wheels. The two brothers were trying to come up with a better way to power a mill. The idea was that if they took two long rotors with intermeshing lobes and put them all the way across a river, they could harness a large portion of the river's power. Had the rotors been made of a modern material, this probably would have worked. However, they were made of wood, and when the wood got wet, it swelled up, jamming the mechanism. While trying to solve that problem, the brothers discovered that the device moved air really well when you put power into it, and they exhibited it at industrial fairs in Philadelphia, Paris, and Vienna, where they won various awards. It turned out There was a lot of demand for a device which could move vast quantities of air. For example, they could be used to ventilate mine shafts and subways. There were other uses as well, and the Roots blowers were a commercially very successful product. Today, the Roots Corporation still exists and is one of the oldest companies in the United States. I suppose the point of all this is that it's important to understand that the Roots blower was not intended to supercharge an automobile engine. Its original commercial purpose was to move air, not to pressurize or supercharge the air, just to move it. When the Roots blower is used to pressurize air, as when supercharging an engine, you run into two problems. First, the air exits the supercharger in pulses. Older Roots blowers would use 2 lobes per rotor, and the lobes were straight, so as they mesh, they force air into the intake manifold or wherever they're pushing it. When not meshing, that air, which is now under pressure in the intake manifold, tries to move back towards the supercharger. These back and forth pulses heat up the air. Hot air is less dense, and the whole point of supercharging an engine is to increase the density of the charge air. So heating the air up works against you. Now keep in mind, you've still increased the density of the air due to the increase in pressure, but the heat will work against you and become a bigger and bigger problem the more pressure you build up. The second problem is something called supercharger slip, and it's a huge deal with Roots supercharging. This isn't belt slip, and slip is not my term. It comes from NACA testing. I'll put sections of these tests up as we go along so you can read stuff directly from NACA if desired. Understand that the Roots blower, and the term blower and supercharger can be used interchangeably. Even the U.S. Navy used the term blower for their big centrifugals. Anyway, the Roots blower doesn't compress air internally, it moves air. If it moves air into a confined space, the air will be compressed. If you shove 100 cubic feet of air into a 50 cubic foot box, it's going to be compressed. That's easy to understand, and that's how the Roots blower provides a boost in manifold pressure. Slip is when air on the high pressure side, or the outlet side, is able to slip back through the clearance volume in the rotor pack into the low pressure, or inlet side. This happens pretty easily because the air inside the Roots supercharger is not pressurized. This causes that already heated up air to take another ride through the supercharger and heat up even more. For these two reasons, pulsing and slip, Roots superchargers tend to have relatively high discharge temperatures when in an application where they have to raise pressure, as in a supercharged engine. The higher the pressure or boost, the bigger the problem, because as that pressure differential increases, it causes more and more slip because the pressure differential between the inlet and outlet of the supercharger increases. At some point, the increase in outlet pressure will no longer provide a meaningful increase in air density due to the rise in temperature. There are some other problems as well. In this range, the energy needed to spin the supercharger goes up dramatically, and the extra heat moves the engine closer to its knock threshold. In short, you hit a wall when trying to raise the boost beyond a certain point, which limits your power. That point, or that wall you hit, varies in location with each application. It's hard to put a really firm number on it, but as a general rule, in typical applications on gasoline, older Roots superchargers are pretty darn good at 5 to 10 pounds per square inch of boost. By older, I mean superchargers that have 2 straight lobes per rotor, like the original Roots Brothers design. I want to stress that I'm giving very general numbers here. With high-octane fuels and very tight tolerances, they can go higher. There have been many improvements to the Roots design over the years. The problem of that pulsing effect has been greatly reduced by an increase in the number of lobes on the rotors and by twisting them. Slip has been reduced by very tight internal clearances and also by a tendency to go with relatively long rotors for the reason NACA explains here. Using Roots blowers with 3 twisted lobes instead of 2 straight ones was commonly done during World War II. The United States heavily used Roots blowers during the war, but not in aircraft. These were typically used in naval landing craft and armored vehicles. For example, the Sherman tanks operated by the U.S. Marine Corps had engines with Root superchargers. The Root supercharged Shermans were diesel powered and largely for logistical reasons tended to be operated by the U.S. Marine Corps as well as some Lend-Lease operators and were generally not used by the U.S. Army. This picture is from the 408-page manual on this tank. If you're interested, you can find it in my Patreon section, along with the NACA reports and a lot of other documents I used in creation of this and other videos on the channel. The supercharger in the Marine Corps Sherman ran at very low boost. It was doing more to evacuate exhaust than to create boost, but it did create some and thus was a supercharger. I started to get off track there, but the point is that more lobes and with some twist really helps the Root supercharger by making it more efficient. With modern computer-aided designs and CNC machining, Root superchargers have come a long way. Today, Eaton has superchargers with 4 lobes and 160 degrees of twist, and these things are quite efficient. To get an understanding of supercharger efficiency and all the numbers related to supercharging in general, we're going to take a look at the 5th generation Eaton M45 supercharger. This displaces 45 cubic inches of air per revolution, hence the name, or about 737 cc's. The M45 features 3-lobe rotors with 60 degrees of twist. This rotor design was pretty state-of-the-art in the late 1990s and into the 2000s, so while it's way behind what we have today, it's a lot better than what they had in the 159 Alfetta. Let's take a look at the compressor map for the M45. On the left side, we have the pressure ratio scale. This causes a lot of confusion, so let's clear it up. Root superchargers generate a pressure ratio, not a specific boost number. This is simply the ratio of inlet pressure to outlet pressure. Let's pretend we put pulleys on the supercharger or gears, whatever we're going to drive it with, to give us a 1.5 to 1 pressure ratio, whatever size pulleys those are. We don't care for now. Let's put a line here for the 1.5 to 1 pressure ratio. Now, for a moment, let's forget about the supercharger's volumetric efficiency curve. Same with the engines. Let's just assume that with the right size pulleys, the supercharger will generate a pressure ratio of 1.5 to 1 at any point in the engine's RPM range. On a standard day at sea level, we have 14.7 psi of atmospheric pressure. Let's assume the intake system for the supercharger has no restrictions in it. In that case, the outlet pressure in this example will be 1.5 times the inlet pressure. To get boost, multiply 14.7 by 1.5 and we get an outlet pressure of 22.05 psi. Now that's pressure absolute, so we need to subtract the inlet pressure to get boost because by definition, boost is pressure above ambient. And when we do the math, we get 7.35 pounds of boost. If you're using the metric system, well, you already know what boost is, 0.5 bar. So why didn't Eaton just put 7.35 on the chart instead of that pressure ratio of 1.5? It's because under different atmospheric conditions, boost may or may not be 7.35 psi. For example, I just checked the weather and the air pressure over in Albuquerque, New Mexico. It's only 12.2 psi there at the moment. Albuquerque's at pretty high altitude. That means that with the same 1.5 to 1 pressure ratio, the engine will only boost 6.1 pounds above ambient and only 3.6 pounds above the example at sea level on a standard day. In other words, in terms of absolute pressure, that 1.5 to 1 ratio gives us 22.05 psi absolute at sea level on a standard day, but only 18.3 psi absolute in Albuquerque. Hopefully that's clear. Root superchargers create a pressure ratio, so lower pressure at the inlet means less boost. Atmospheric conditions, as well as the supercharger's intake and air filter design, can have a pretty big effect here. Of course, the fix if racing at high altitude is to use pulleys that will spin the supercharger fast enough to make up for it. At the bottom, on the x-axis, we have cubic meters of air per hour. Most supercharger maps have the weight of air here, including the maps from later Eaton superchargers, but for whatever reason, this one has a measurement of volume. As a quick side note, a number of years ago I wrote a book on supercharging, and beforehand I wrote to all the manufacturers of superchargers and asked permission to use their charts in my book, and they all said yes to that, every single one. However, I also asked them if I could add notes to the charts for standardization because some had SAE numbers, some metric, some based things on volume, some weight, and I felt that adding notes would help my readers compare the different models. They all said no to that. I ended up making my own charts for the book. That book is on Amazon, but it's a lot less money to read it in my Patreon section. You can find it there at the captain's level, which is only $5. Lower Patreon levels are as low as $1. I actually need to update that book as there have been some pretty big changes in the supercharging world since the last update, especially in regards to the viability of centrifugals, meaning the proliferation of 8 and 10 speed automatic transmissions often make a centrifugal supercharger the best choice. Then again, I'm not sure I'll update the book when I can make a video instead. Back to our chart, we have green dashed lines and numbers running diagonally. That is supercharger RPM. Let's say we're putting this thing on a 1.5 liter engine with a 7,000 RPM redline. That is about how the Alfetta engine was run in the earlier years, say 1938, but I'm using a somewhat more generic example so I can use known supercharger data for this explanation. Now it just so happens that on a 4-stroke engine that puts out about 1 horsepower per cubic inch, a supercharger that has half that engine's displacement will have a pressure ratio about equal to the supercharger drive ratio. In other words, our 1500cc engine is about 90 cubic inches. The Eaton M45 is about half that, so a 1.5 to 1 drive ratio will give about a 1.5 to 1 pressure ratio. So at 7,000 engine RPM, our supercharger will be spinning at 10,500 RPM. I'll put a line for that on the chart. And by the way, I am going somewhere with all of this. It will soon be very clear why some applications need dual stages. I'm leading to that. The Alfetta's engine in its original form in 1938 did have a single-stage supercharger with 7 pounds of boost and a 7,000 RPM engine redline. That's very close to what we have on our chart right now. It's worth mentioning that Alfa Romeo only built 9 of these engines ever. The last one was built in 1942. Alfa just kept souping up the same engine, not just the same engine design, the same engine, via higher RPM limits, and most of all via more boost, which is how they eventually got it up to 425 horsepower in race form for 1951. Back to our chart. We have to consider the volumetric efficiency of the supercharger. This chart is not M45 specific, it's generic, but close enough. I actually based it off of Eaton's data for a 4th generation 62 cubic inch supercharger when I made it. Notice how supercharger speed affects volumetric efficiency and how it drops off at lower supercharger RPM. That means it's not actually going to move 45 cubic inches of air per revolution. It will be less than that. How much less depends on where you are on the chart. That decreased efficiency at low RPM causes boost to suffer. Thus, our 1.5 to 1 drive ratio won't really give us that 1.5 to 1 pressure ratio. It's only going to give us about 84% of that at 10,500 supercharger RPM, and even less when turning more slowly. We have to plan for that by spinning the supercharger a little faster. In other words, our 1.5 to 1 drive ratio will give us 7.35 pounds of boost with a 100% volumetrically efficient supercharger, but we don't have that. So I'm going to bump the drive ratio up to 1.6 to 1. So here's a line for that with the new supercharger speed of 11,200 RPM at the engine's red line of 7,000. Now let's graph the expected boost with a white line, taking into account the supercharger's volumetric efficiency. I'll add in the boost numbers in PSI as our metric folks can see boost in bar by just subtracting 1 from the pressure ratio on the left side of the chart. So the boost curve isn't flat. Boost drops off at lower RPM because of the volumetric efficiency curve of the supercharger itself. Also, the volumetric efficiency of the engine itself will come into play here, but that's another issue and it's not something I'm covering today. Based on the supercharger's volumetric efficiency, we get about 7.5 pounds of boost at the engine's red line of 7,000 RPM and about 5 psi down around 2,600 engine RPM. That's a pretty decent boost curve. This isn't too far from how far the actual Alfa Romeo engine was set up initially. Of course, I'm using a more modern supercharger for this example because I wanted to go with real data. I'm also using a theoretical 1.5 liter engine, but it isn't too far from the Alfetta's engine in 1938. Although rules of thumb are not that precise, using the basic rules I've outlined here and in another video about supercharger drive ratios will get you pretty close. So if you put a Eaton M45 on a 90 cubic inch engine that has somewhere near 1 horsepower per cubic inch and drive it at a 1.6 to 1 drive ratio, you will have about 7.5 pounds of peak boost. A couple caveats. We're talking about a somewhat modern root supercharger like a 4th gen Eaton or better. This isn't just a theory. I've done it many times. For example, my Alfa Romeo Spider has a 57 cubic inch supercharger on a 2-liter engine. I'm spinning it with a 2 to 1 drive ratio, and I get just over 11 pounds of peak boost. Back to our Alfa's race engine, it had 1479 cc's, and early versions of it ran a single supercharger with 2 straight lobes per rotor. That means the rotor design was primitive, but Alfa probably made up for that with very precise tolerances, which could be even tighter than normal because they flowed methanol through this thing for internal cooling. Thus, the rotors wouldn't grow too much from growing hot. It was probably driven at a 1.35 to 1 ratio, and my best guess is that it displaced about 70 cubic inches per revolution. Back to our real-world compressor map for the M45. Notice the shaded areas our boost line is passing through. These represent the adiabatic efficiency of the supercharger. Adiabatic efficiency could be a whole video in itself, but just know that a higher number is better. The lower the number, the more the supercharger heats up the air. At low RPM, we pass through the higher efficiency areas with a peak number of 67%, which isn't bad. However, as we move to the right on the chart and up, it gets worse and worse, going as low as maybe 55%. That's going to heat the air up quite a bit, but frankly, at these lower boost levels, it's just not a problem. We need more boost, so according to conventional wisdom, we can just spin the supercharger faster, and normally that would be a great answer. For example, if we set up the drive ratio at 2.2 to 1, so the rotors will spin 2.2 times for every engine revolution, that should give us a pressure ratio of about 2 to 1, or roughly 14.7 pounds of boost on a standard day at sea level. I can't say exactly what the boost will be because the supercharger's volumetric efficiency goes up with RPM but down with boost, but more RPM should give more boost, making it hard to calculate this, but 14.7 psi is a good enough guess here. So that's great. But now we have another problem, one which you can probably already see. The supercharger itself doesn't have the RPM capability to handle this. The supercharger's maximum RPM isn't shown on the chart, but for this supercharger, it's 16,000 RPM. The Alfa 1.5 liter Grand Prix engine could reach 10,500 RPM in its final form. At that speed, and with a 2.2 to 1 drive ratio, the supercharger would be at 23,100 RPM, way beyond the little M45 16,000 RPM limit. Not only that, but the supercharger's efficiency goes down with both RPM and boost. So its adiabatic numbers are going to be in the 40s here, probably in the low 40s for most of the RPM range where we're trying to make good power. That's just not going to work, especially in a non-intercooled application like the Alfa 159 Alfetta. Those low numbers will also mean that the drive power requirements of the supercharger will go way up. It takes energy to create all that extra heat, and there is a cost associated with that. There always is. There is no free lunch. Normally, when supercharging an engine, this RPM limitation means that you need a bigger supercharger, so you can spin it more slowly to get the same boost. So let's double the size of the supercharger in our hypothetical example. It's still the same basic design, but now we're using the Eaton M90, which of course displaces 90 cubic inches per revolution, or roughly 1.5 liters. Let's spin it with a 1.1 to 1 drive ratio, so when the engine is at 10,000 RPM, the supercharger will be at 11,000. Here is the projected boost curve. It's sloped down a little more than we would like at the low end because in this low supercharger RPM range, we're to the left of the supercharger's volumetric efficiency curve. This isn't terrible, it's just not ideal. On the plus side, we're at least in the mid to high 50s in terms of adiabatic efficiency, which is okay. But notice that we miss the supercharger's most efficient areas. There's nothing we can do about that without lowering boost, which we don't want to do. We could go down a bit in supercharger size and spin it faster to try to flatten out the boost curve, but this 90 cubic inch supercharger is workable for this scenario. Next, we need to get this engine up to at least 30 pounds of boost at 9,300 RPM. That means we're going to need about a 3.2 to 1 pressure ratio. You can see the problem as we raise boost even above about 10 psi or a 1.7 to 1 pressure ratio. Adiabatic efficiency goes down. Thus, the supercharger's discharge temperatures go up. Keep in mind they go up anyway from just raising the boost. You're compressing the air more. But the supercharger's inefficiency raises them even more. In this case, a lot more. Here is a chart to give you an idea of just what effect a drop in adiabatic efficiency has on discharge temperatures. I know the chart doesn't go that high. I made it for something else. But you can see that at 30 plus pounds of boost with adiabatic numbers going into the low 40s, probably into the low 30s, it's going to get ugly. The power to drive the supercharger goes up as well. Again, all that extra heat has to be created somehow. These are the numbers from the drive power chart from a 4th generation M90, so it's pretty close. And as you can see, the drive power needed goes up with both RPM and boost. So the power gain from each pound of boost will be reduced as we go higher and higher because of the discharge temperature and drive power requirements. We can't get anywhere near 30 psi with a 1951 Root supercharger. Even today, there is no Root supercharger that can do that, at least not in efficient or practical terms. Publications vary on just how much boost the 159 had. I'm pretty confident it was around 35 psi, but some sources have it at 30 and some as high as 42. Either way, it's way beyond the normal capability of a Roots type. So how did they do it? Well, this is where the second supercharger comes in. Remember we talked about the pressure ratio of the supercharger. It doesn't know what boost is. It only knows the ratio of the inlet pressure to the outlet pressure. Therefore, if we boost the inlet pressure, outlet pressure will go up by a factor equal to the pressure ratio. Before we do that, let's go back to our earlier supercharger map, the one with the little MP45 supercharger. Now instead of a 7,000 RPM engine redline, let's run it out to 10,500. That's going to spin the supercharger up to about 16,800 RPM, a bit beyond its normal redline, but not much. It will be okay, as it will be under 15,000 at the engine's race redline of 9,300. Now we're up around 8 psi due to the increase in volumetric efficiency with supercharger RPM. We're also running right through the supercharger's efficient area, combined with an extra 32% more RPM at the high end and valve timing and lift to back that up. Power is up around 240 horsepower. Now we need to increase it via more boost, and we can do that easily with a second supercharger stage. Now terms vary, but for clarification, the supercharger we are adding is actually the first stage. So in this case, the M45 becomes our second stage. It's confusing because the M45 was already on the engine and was the only stage. Now we added a supercharger blowing into it, and the M45 becomes the second stage. The U.S. Navy called these first and second stages main and auxiliary respectively, so whatever floats your boat. So now we have two stages of supercharging. We will set up the new first stage with a pressure ratio of 2 to 1. So we have atmospheric pressure at the supercharger inlet, but double atmospheric pressure at the outlet. In other words, we are supercharging the supercharger with 14.7 pounds of boost. So our engine's primary supercharger, the first one, aka second stage, that we put on normally provides about 8 pounds of boost to the engine, but now that supercharger has 14.7 psi at its inlet from the additional supercharger. So how much boost do you think the engine has now? Take a minute and pause and think about that for a minute. We've got 14.7 psi at the inlet, and that supercharger normally on its own would then give us another 8 psi. Usually people think it's going to be 14.7 plus 8 for a total of 22.7 pounds of boost, but that is not the case. Remember, it's all about the pressure ratios, and this is where people get lost, but you got this, especially if you made it this far in this type of a video. Our 14.7 pounds of boost plus atmospheric pressure is 29.4 inches of pressure absolute, total pressure. That pressure is delivered to the primary supercharger inlet and raised in this case at a ratio of 1.6 to 1. Multiply that pressure ratio by the inlet pressure of 29.4 absolute, and we get 47.04 psi absolute coming out of that little supercharger. Subtract 14.7 to get boost, and we have 32.34 pounds of boost from our dual-stage root supercharging system. So while the root supercharger, at least the Gen 5 Eatons, are off the chart inefficient above 14.7 pounds of boost, you can get over 30 pounds by using two of them, one blowing into another. In fact, if you run them both at a 2-to-1 pressure ratio, you'll have over 44 pounds of boost, but with the supercharger efficiency numbers of a unit with less than 15 pounds of boost. That's the magic of dual-stage supercharging. Of course, you're still paying a cost to drive two superchargers, but the cost of driving two relatively efficient superchargers is much better than driving one really big inefficient supercharger moving that much air at that pressure ratio. It would just be too far out of its efficiency range. The dual stage arrangement also provides an additional ram air benefit. If set up with an intake that uses the forward motion of the car to ram air into the supercharger intake, there will be a boost in inlet pressure. This is about 1/10 of a psi at 80 miles per hour, but at the 159 Alfetta's top speed of 190, it's about 0.64 psi. That gets multiplied twice with the dual stage setup. So when it goes through the first stage in our example we used earlier, it's doubled by the 2-to-1 pressure ratio. So we now have an extra 1.28 pounds of boost without any drop in supercharger efficiency or cost to drive it. Then going through the second stage, it's multiplied by 1.6 for a total of 2 pounds of extra boost. The Alfetta 159 race car took full advantage of this with a big retractable ram air scoop just forward of the windscreen. Typically, it would be closed at the start of the race to avoid ingesting debris. The other cars were throwing stuff up off the track all the time, open-wheel cars. But once the Alfetta was out in front, they would open this scoop for a boost in power of around 25 horsepower at higher speeds. The earlier 158, which looks very similar, did not have this scoop. Instead, it had a big inlet, trumpet-style inlet that took under hood air, but it was still relatively cool air and under some pressure. Practically the whole front end of the 158 and 159 was a big grill to let in as much cooling air as possible, and they used a lot of louvers to let the hot air out. Back to our discussion of ram air, this was common in aircraft. In fact, it was the default setup in fighter planes. For example, the North American P-51 Mustang could be operated with ram air on or off, so it did have ram air. The performance numbers were much lower with it off. The lower numbers can be seen here as altitude limitations. Lower power means a lower maximum reachable altitude with a given supercharger drive ratio. The Mustang used a dual-stage centrifugal setup designed by Rolls-Royce. The reason a pilot would use the ram air off position was much like the reason a 159 driver would do so. If the plane was in a situation where the engine could ingest debris, like when taking off from a gravel runway or flying in a sandstorm, they would run it with ram air off until in clean air. As with the 159, the Mustang's dual-stage system made the ram air extra effective because the pressure rise was multiplied twice. Back to the Alfetta. How does it get away with so much boost and with no intercooling, no fuel injection, and no electronic aids to assist in avoiding knock? Well, they pulled this off in a few ways. Let's have a quick overview of the engine. The engine itself was a straight 8-cylinder 1.5 liter. Straight 8s were easy to put in a streamlined race car and were the most common winning design of the era. It had somewhat hemispherical combustion chambers and double overhead camshafts. Both intake and exhaust valves have 36 millimeter diameters, and they were angled to each other at about 100 degrees. That steep angle was needed to fit the giant valves, and they are gigantic compared to the engine's 58 millimeter bore. Both valves have diameters equal to 69-point-something% of the cylinder's bore. To put that into perspective, Chrysler's mighty 426 Hemi, an engine known for having huge valves, has an intake valve 53% of the cylinder bore and an exhaust valve 47% of the bore. To keep it from knocking, there were cooling passages in the cylinder head designed specifically to keep that area really cool, but the main anti-knock strategy was to burn methanol instead of gasoline. It was a specific mix from Shell, which was 98.5% methanol. I don't know what the other 1.5 was. Methanol is not only a high-octane fuel, it has a strong cooling effect because it evaporates very quickly, and Alpha exploited this to the extreme. The fuel entered through a giant 3-barrel carburetor mounted to the first stage supercharger inlet. So the fuel would start cooling as it passed through the first stage supercharger and then the second stage, resulting in lower discharge air temperatures, and I suspect allowing for very tight rotor-to-wall clearances, thus reducing supercharger slip. The fuel would then enter the cylinders, where it would cool things off even more. Alfa Romeo ran this engine with a very rich mixture and used camshafts with a lot of overlap, so that during the overlap period, meaning when both the intake valve and exhaust valves are open at the same time, cooling methanol would flow over both valves and then out the exhaust. Obviously, sending unburned fuel out the exhaust for cooling purposes meant that the car consumed its methanol fuel like there was no tomorrow. Methanol is not a particularly efficient fuel anyway, meaning you need to burn a lot of it for a given amount of power, which hurts fuel economy. That combined with the rich mixture meant that this car got only about 1.2 miles per gallon when racing. It made a lot of power, and it was very reliable. However, it drank a lot of methanol. As I mentioned earlier, the races it didn't win in 1951 were entirely due to this fuel economy issue. The Ferraris, with their 4.5-liter engines, could go farther between refueling stops. That brings up an interesting point. The rules for the 1951 Formula One season allowed a maximum of 1.5 liters of engine displacement if supercharged, but 4.5 liters if not supercharged. That shows what a big advantage supercharging gives. Even then, the 1.5-liter supercharged cars were faster, but again, at the expense of fuel economy. One interesting thing to point out here is that there is no form of automobile racing where normally aspirated cars can compete successfully with supercharged cars without rules to level the playing field. In 1951, they attempted to level the playing field by allowing the normally aspirated cars to run with 3 times the engine displacement of the supercharged cars, and that still wasn't enough. The Alfa wasn't the only Formula One car running with dual-stage supercharging that season. The British showed up with the BRM Type 15. This thing is fantastic. Now, if you think the Alfa's 1.5-liter engine has tiny cylinders being an 8-cylinder 1.5, the BRM will knock your socks off. This thing runs a 1.5-liter V16. The cylinders have a 49.5 millimeter bore, 48.3 millimeter stroke. Those are the smallest cylinders I know of in the history of auto racing. This engine also features dual-stage supercharging. However, it uses dual-stage centrifugals. Dual staging improves the efficiency of centrifugals in much the same way it does with root superchargers. However, it doesn't eliminate the centrifugal's main problem, which is relatively low boost at low and mid-range engine RPM. The team at BRM, and probably everyone else doing this type of racing at the time, were quite skeptical of the idea of using a centrifugal in this application. But Rolls-Royce convinced BRM that they could build a system that would start boosting by 6,000 RPM, halfway to the engine's expected 12,000 RPM redline. BRM accepted. I should point out that Rolls-Royce had a lot of experience building dual-stage centrifugal superchargers, and they pioneered the idea of putting both of the centrifugal superchargers on the same shaft to save space. This was commonly done in Spitfires, and then when the Rolls-Royce design went over to North American, they contracted Packard to make engines for the P-51 Mustang using that same basic principle. So Rolls-Royce had a lot of experience with dual-stage centrifugals, and they were really the only ones that were able to do it successfully with both of them on the same shaft. So moving along, Rolls-Royce then built a dual-stage centrifugal supercharger with both compressors being driven by the same shaft and at the same speed. This was literally a scaled-down version of the two-stage setup from a Supermarine Spitfire Mark IX. The BRM race car used a 5.5-inch compressor, 5.5-inch diameter, on the second stage, and it was fed by a 6.5-inch compressor on the first stage. Initially, they used a 6-inch first stage, but bumped it up another half-inch during development. This engine had massive potential power, but during the 1951 Formula One season, it just couldn't compete with the Alfa 159. While the BRM should have had about 600 horsepower in 1951, they had to dial it back to 430 in a desperate attempt to get reliability out of this, not just the engine, but the whole car. That didn't work. It was still terribly unreliable. Even when it was running, it was not a match for the Alfa 159. The BRM's V16 was much heavier than the Alfa straight 8, 525 pounds versus 363, although peak power was slightly greater for the BRM, 430 horsepower versus 425, and that's really nothing when you consider dyno variations. But the Alfa had far more power throughout the RPM range and in a much lighter and better handling car. The BRM did have some boost at 6,000 RPM, as promised by Rolls-Royce, but as is normal with centrifugals, it didn't have much. Some boost and enough boost are two different things. I made a rough dyno graph for these two engines in their 1951 race specs, and it really shows the difference, not only in the way power is delivered in these two engines, but in the way root superchargers deliver power versus centrifugals. Although the BRM engine has a very slight edge up top, it doesn't really matter. The Alfetta's engine is far more powerful throughout most of the RPM range. The lighter engine gave Alfa another advantage. It allowed the Alfa Romeo racing team to put more weight into other parts of the car that might be prone to braking, like the rear-mounted transaxle or other components needing to handle that high power. Overall, the Alfa was a slightly lighter car, but far more rugged. All in all, the BRM just couldn't compete in 1951. The Alfa was faster, better handling, much more reliable. The BRM's 1951 season was a disaster. Normally, they could not even start the race, let alone finish one. The one time they did finish a race, they did it with two cars and finished 5th and 7th. Sadly for both the Alfetta and the BRM Type 15, rule changes made both cars obsolete. The next year, 1952, there wasn't really a Formula One season, or another way to look at it is that they ran Formula One under Formula 2 rules in 1952. Either way, the displacement allowances were cut back. Now, normally aspirated cars had to be 2 liters or under, and supercharged cars were limited to 750 cc's, and high-octane fuels were disallowed, seriously limiting the boost of the superchargers. BRM did race the car in non-Formula One races in 1952. These were generally minor races in Great Britain. In many cases, they either didn't start or didn't finish the race, but in a few cases, they did start to have some success. The car was getting better. It was also getting more powerful. In fact, in 1952, the little V16 dynoed at 482 horsepower, which is the highest verifiable number it ever reached. There is speculation that it was at 600 horsepower, possibly even more a year or two later, and that's possible. However, it's based on reported boost gauge readings and calculations. The highest actual dyno number was 482, which is still very impressive. Ultimately, the BRM Type 15 was a failure on the racetrack, but it did help push the limits of technology and kick-started British efforts in post-war Grand Prix and Grand Prix type racing. It was also one of the most powerful cars in existence due to its dual-stage supercharging system, which is why I'm talking about it in this video. I should also point out that the BRM Type 15 led to the success of other British efforts on the world stage of auto racing. So in that respect, it was a success. Alfa Romeo sort of went the other way, and after 1951, never again dominated in Formula One, although they did have a lot of success in lower-tier racing. Today, someone is building exact replicas of the BRM Type 15s for vintage racing, as the few surviving originals are considered too valuable to race. Dual-stage supercharging with mechanically driven superchargers was incredibly effective. It was absolutely proven in World War II fighter planes and, of course, in Formula One. However, rule changes in F1 forced the technology out. The race organizers had to find a way to slow the cars down and have at least some level of safety, and that started with efforts to slow the cars down with limits on engine displacement and rules restricting fuel choices. The supercharged cars were simply forced out of the series in an effort to make racing safer. It's interesting that 1952 was the first year they required helmets. The total lack of safety back then is just staggering. I mean, look at these cars and imagine going 190 miles an hour in them. On the aviation side, the reason dual staging faded out is a bit more complex. A supercharger is good. Dual stage superchargers are better. So why not three stages? Why not four? You might think expense, law of diminishing returns, packaging issues, all of which are factors. But the real problem is this. If you have enough stages, you can compress the air enough that you don't need a cylinder with a piston in it anymore. A huge portion of a piston engine is there to provide compression, a combustion chamber, and a mechanism to turn up and down motion into rotational motion. Remember that Latham supercharger I showed earlier? It uses axial flow compressors. This jet engine uses those as well, 8 stages worth of them. All of that compressed air goes into a burner or a combustion chamber where it's mixed with fuel and ignited. The expanding gases then pass through a turbine wheel, forcing it to spin, and it's on a shaft that is also attached to the compressors and spins the whole engine. The exhaust that's left exits out the back as thrust, and that's your basic jet engine. So once you supercharge the air to a certain point with a number of compressors, you just don't need a piston engine anymore. A turbine engine like this can make far more power. Unlike a piston engine, the combustion here never stops, and all the parts are rotating the same direction. It just has far more power potential than any piston engine. Thus, the question of why not 3 stages of supercharging or 4 is answered by the simple fact that at a certain point, you might as well build a turbine engine, and that's exactly what happened in aviation. The turbojet replaced the high-powered piston engines, eliminating the need for multi-stage supercharging and relegating piston engines to lower power, lower altitude duty in aircraft. Thus, this technology has been largely forgotten, but it's still fascinating and may still have a place in the automotive world. So I wouldn't say it's dead, just sort of dormant. Please like and subscribe, and please consider joining my Patreon, or consider buying a mug. There are various styles with the vehicle specs or without, different sizes of mugs, colors, and so on. It really helps out the channel. There are links directly to them in the video description. Oh, and just one more thing. I somehow skipped over this, but I should explain supercharger sizing and selection for the first stage or aux supercharger of a 2-stage system. As a general rule, 2-stage supercharging setups run a big first stage and a relatively smaller second stage. They often spin at the same speed, but that's not a requirement. You could have a small supercharger spinning fast for the second stage and a slower turning bigger supercharger for the first. The way to look at this is to view the engine and second stage as one thing. In other words, think of the example engine we used earlier, a 240 horsepower, 10,000 RPM engine with 8 pounds of boost. To get it up to 425 horsepower, we need to add 77% more power, plus whatever we lose due to the heat, plus what we need to drive the additional supercharger. Now, there are a few ways we can do this, but one way is to look at the total airflow into the engine. We have that right here, about 650 cubic meters an hour. To keep the math easy, we're going to double the pressure at the primary supercharger inlet. Again, we need 77% more air mass, but we will lose some due to density. We will lose some density due to heat, and we need a bit extra to drive the blower. Doubling it will be close enough. So we're looking for a supercharger that can flow 1,300 cubic meters an hour at a 2-to-1 pressure ratio. The M90 we looked at earlier is a bit too small. It just can't quite do the job within the confines of this chart. That's not to say you couldn't make it work if it was all you had, but life is a lot easier when supercharging if you start with the right unit for the job. A 112 cubic inch Eaton will do the job. You should now be able to look at this chart with what you've learned and see that it can provide a 2-to-1 pressure ratio and the 1,300 cubic meter per minute flow that we need. What's more, it will be in the 56 to 50% adiabatic range for most of the time, which is okay. The downside is that it will need a bit less supercharger RPM than the primary stage, so we can't spin them both on the same shaft, or if we do, there needs to be a gear reduction somewhere to slow the 112 cubic inch unit down to around a 1.4-to-1 drive ratio. That will put the supercharger at about 13,000 RPM at 9,300 engine RPM, which is where we're aiming to make our 425 horsepower. Obviously, that's a rough calculation, but it will be in the ballpark, and we're going over general principles here anyway. Interestingly, Eaton considers dual staging in the design of at least some of their superchargers, specifically the TVS-2 series. Not that a lot has to be done there, it's mostly a question of seals to handle the high discharge pressure that will be seen on the second stage. With their modern TVS-2 designs, some pretty crazy boost numbers are possible. However, I haven't seen any modern setups using dual stage Roots blowers. In the rare cases where dual staging is used today, it's normally a case of a turbocharger blowing into a Roots. Sometimes this is called compound boosting, which is completely unrelated to turbo compounding, which is another bit of forgotten tech I have a video on. Please check out that video as well. That's all for now. Goodbye and have a great day.